Monday?
At 5 o'clock.
Monday at 5 p.m. is the last day to register to vote if you haven't signed up or are not registered already. That would be Monday. Early voting has already started, so I'd recommend that you do that early, avoid the lines and the rush, okay? But we get that done. Our guest speaker today is Dr. John Ikerd. He was with us last year about the same time. And he's put together another talk that is very interesting. He put the talking points on a paper. I've posted that paper on our website, QOLSD.com. If you go there, there's a document section and you can download the paper. It's a very good talk. And what's good about downloading that, you can read it on your own time as well and maybe get some more detail out of what he says here today. But it also has references, where he got his information from, what studies, when, who did it, all those kind of things. So that's good to have. So too often we get in discussions with people and we know some facts, but we don't remember where it came from or who did that study, what university. So you have some of this information at your fingertips, all right? So, Dr. Ikerd, welcome.
I kind of feel like I'm way down here, separate from you all, scattered all across the auditorium. I know that the organizers were expecting a few more folks to show up here today, but I just want to say that it doesn't really matter to me. I kind of took the philosophy a long time ago that whenever I went somewhere to speak, that the people who really needed to be there were going to be there. And so if I got prepared and I said what I needed to say there at that time, then whatever was supposed to happen there that day would happen. And so just not to be concerned about it one way or the other. Now I will say, when there's fewer people like this that show up, a lot of times I might go somewhere and there might be 200 or 300 people there, but there might only be 3 or 4 people who really needed to hear what I have to say, otherwise just wasting the rest of us time. So when you got a small turnout like this, it means that it should be important to everybody, including me, to say what I should say here today, and so that's what I'll attempt to do. I chose a topic today having to do with the topic of responsible agriculture, responsible government. That is the challenge of rural America. Start off by saying that when I was growing up on a farm, small farm in southwest Missouri in the 1940s and 50s, that was a time of relative prosperity in rural America, and there were hopes that the future would continue to be even better. We'd survived the Great Depression and World War II and come out in pretty good shape, and we had new technologies that came out of the wartime technologies, such as the tractors that were cheaper tractors that were replacing horses at that time, and all sorts of different things that were taking much of the drudgery out of farming that had been there through the decades. We had grade A milking barns come into our part of the country, and my dad was able to build a grade A milking barn, and that raised the level of income, but also increased the stability of income for farmers in that area. I'd say probably that was the time that rural communities had probably been more prosperous then than perhaps that they'd ever been, because they were benefiting from the post-war economic boom that came about after World War II. And at that time, there was very little indication of the negative effects of that post-war boom, the emphasis on economics and those technologies that came out of it. You see, the focus on economic survival and economic sufficiency that it brought on by the Great Depression kind of become an obsession. We become obsessed with the idea that economic growth would bring inevitable greater well-being. And there was no indication that the industrial agricultural technologies that seemed such a blessing would turn into a curse as far as the family farms were concerned. And a few decades later then, we found rural America in a situation where that hopefulness for continued prosperity had turned into frustration and hopelessness as we looked to the future. So what happened? What happened to change all that? What I call what happened is a decades in continuing economic colonization of rural America. Economic colonization is a term that came along after political colonization, whenever the countries that had politically colonized other countries continued their economic dominance over those countries and continued to exploit their resources and extract the wealth from those countries. What we have today is a continued economic colonization, but today, rather than it being done by colonizing nations, it's being done by large multinational corporations. And they're doing it either with the acceptance or over the objection of the national governments of the country that are being colonized. And this is basically the same thing that's been happening to rural America. It's been happening to rural areas all around the world. We're colonizing our rural areas, exploiting the resources, exploiting the people, extracting the wealth from those areas for the benefit of someone else rather than the people that are there. And just like in previous political colonies and economic colonies, the promises of prosperity have turned into the reality of continuing poverty. Colonization has never been about civilization. It's never been about economic development. It's been about exploitation and extraction. Just like slavery before it, political colonization became unacceptable. So you had to quit that. But economic colonization, particularly the economic colonization of rural America, continues unabated. This isn't just idle speculation on my part. A recent Wall Street Journal, 2017, the Wall Street Journal came out with an article they called Rural America, the New Inner Cities. It pointed out that rural America during most of the 20th century did relatively well up until the latter part of it, and that the depressed areas were the inner cities, the ghettos where your drugs and crime and unemployment and poverty was prevalent. That was a lower scale. But they said all that's changed. And they put it out and quoted the statistics that in terms of poverty, attainment of college education, teen birth, divorce, premature death from heart disease and cancer, permanent disability, unemployment among adult males. Rural areas now are at the very bottom of 5 different classes that they categorized in the U.S., below the inner cities. Whether it was intended or not, industrial agriculture has been a means by which rural America has been colonized economically, the industrialization of agriculture. For example, the large-scale confinement animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, or factory farms that are the source of contention in this county. What they have ultimately done wherever they've gone is they've replaced the independent farmers, the independent animal producers, with contract workers, low-paid contract workers, and the previous farmers are turned into little more than hog and chicken house superintendents. And in many cases, the crop producers, through contracts with operations that they have to buy their seed and fertilizers and pesticides all in one place and so on, have become little more than tractor drivers on highly automated, sophisticated machinery. And as a consequence of that, we see that the soils are eroded, the fields are, the air and the water is polluted with agricultural chemicals and biological waste. And our rural communities in such places where we have industrial agriculture are left with depleted soils, depleted aquifers, polluted air and water, and farmers who really don't know how to farm anymore. Wendell Berry, the writer of Kentucky Farmer Philosopher, wrote in response to a New York Times book review that had been critical of the culture of rural America. And his response was, he says, "The business of America has been largely and without apology the plundering of rural America, from which everything of value, minerals, timber, farm animals, farm crops, and labor, has been taken at the lowest possible price. As apparently the enlightened ones, or apparently none of the enlightened ones, has seen in flying over or bypassing on our interstate highways. Its too large fields are toxic and eroding. Its streams and rivers poisoned. Its forests mangled. Its towns dying or dead, along with their locally owned small businesses. Its children are leaving after high school and not coming back. Too many of the children are not working at anything. Too many are transfixed by various screens. Too many are on drugs. Too many are dying. The promise of rural development is nothing more than rural desecration. Perhaps your community is not even close to this. There are still communities in Iowa. My community is not close to this, but I have lived in communities and many communities across the country look very much like what I've described here. This is the legacy of the industrialization of agriculture as the tool of economic colonization. You know, the tactics obviously are different today than they were in earlier colonial times, but the strategies, the basic strategies are still very much the same. For example, the promise is always we're going to bring rural economic development. In the case of CAFOs, I'm sure you've been told that they will bring badly needed jobs, that the buildings will bring increased tax revenue, that you'll have more money to build and maintain roads and schools and health care and the other public services they will provide. But the reality will be, as it has been everywhere these operations have gone, that you will end up with fewer lower paid workers, and they will displace more of the independent farms than the jobs they create. And if they don't displace local farmers in your particular community, the people that come in to work in these operations at low-paid jobs will have greater demand for public services such as healthcare and education and other things than they will contribute to your tax base. And the cost of other public services will go up as well, particularly for maintenance of road. The county farm-to-market roads were not built to handle the big semi-trucks that will come in, bringing in feed to the CAFOs and taking out hogs, and they will have to go week after week, month after month, regardless of the roads, regardless of the weather conditions, because that's the way these operations have to function. This isn't just some anecdotal evidence from somebody that's gone around and looked at these operations. We now have more than 60 years of academic, socioeconomic research validating what I've talked about here. 2006, the North Dakota Attorney General's Office commissioned a study to review the literature, the scientific literature that had to do with linking industrialization of agriculture with rural economic development. The author from the University of North Dakota cited 56 different peer-reviewed journal articles, socioeconomic journals, that indicated that the growing community concerns about the negative social economic impacts of industrial agriculture were warranted, and that those concerns were growing worse as we began to see the negative environmental and social consequences of concentrated animal feeding operations. He particularly pointed at the fact that they consistently diminish and tear the social fabric of rural communities. The Pew Charitable Trust commissioned a study, 2008 study. Again, they cited over 50 years of academic research and actual experience, and they had a commission that had people from industry as well as from science and well as from agriculture on it. And reports said that wherever we have industrial agriculture becomes a dominant feature in the rural economy, we have increased number of lower income workers and greater income in social inequality, reduced activity on main streets, reduced volumes of retail sales, slower numbers of stores in the area, continued economic depression. And these studies now are about 10 years old, but the Wall Street Journal data confirms that the trends have simply continued in the same direction. You know, it's no mystery. After all, who would want to live near a CAFO or a factory farm other than someone who's making money from it, that does it because that's the way they're making their money? You know, there was a study in 2015 where they reviewed property values, real estate transactions on property values for up to 7 miles away from CAFOs. And the decrease in property value ranged anywhere from, in general, from 3% to 26% based on a range of different things, distance, wind direction, things of that nature. And for residences very close to CAFOs, right next to them, property values down by as much as 88%. So you can see, what the negative economic impact is, but it's not just the negative economic input. In my experience over the last 25 years, meeting with people in communities such as yours in 17 states, 4 provinces of Canada, even in the United Kingdom, the experience has consistently been what I think is one of the most important, is the controversy that arises over kind of the industrialization of agriculture, and particularly CAFOs, tears the social fabric of communities apart. And that's a lasting impact that goes on indefinitely into the future, socially, culturally, for the overall quality of life. Neighbors who complain about the CAFOs they're told by the people in what I call the agricultural establishment. That includes the agribusiness corporations, the big farm organizations like Farm Bureau and the Cattlemen's Association, the hog producers and so on, the big commodity organizations. They say, well, the impacts are inevitable. That's just what agriculture is all about. And he says, after all, these CAFOs, these factory farms, these industrial agriculture, they have much more sophisticated technologies now for managing the manure and the odors and various other things than the independent family farmers, that they're doing a better job than the farmers were that let their hogs run outside, and they talk about them running in the streams and things of that nature. What they ignore is the fact that when we're talking about these concentrated animal feeding off, we're concentrating thousands of animals in one place, in small places. A 2,500 head CAFO, where they come in just under that to avoid being called a CAFO, but 2,500 head of hogs will produce as much biological waste or raw sewage as a town of 7,500 to 10,000 people. That's about the size of where I live, Fairfield, Iowa. Fairfield, Iowa has just spent $18 million to improve our sewage system. And we have a CAFO coming into our county that will produce 3 times as much raw sewage or biological waste as the city of Fairfield, that will simply take it out and spread it on the fields. And what happens if concentrating too much of this in one place, you don't get it spread out in a way that can be efficiently utilized by the crops out here. And what you do is when you concentrate it in one place, then you're also separating the animals from the grain production, which is in more distant areas, and you end up over-applying the manure, as far as fertilizer is concerned, closer to the CAFO, because of the handling cost soon absorbs or offsets the value of the manure as fertilizers, and you end up over-fertilizing the fields with chemical fertilizers elsewhere to produce the grain to ship to the CAFO operations. So that's what we created here. If you want to see the kind of the numbers that bear out what I'm talking about now, if you want to see the numbers, you can look at the state. I think we turned that with something. If you look at the state of Iowa, for example, the EPA requires that each state submit a list of what they call impaired waters, which basically means polluted streams and polluted aquifers and things of that nature within the state. In the state of Iowa, between 1998 and 2016, we had a 4-fold increase, a 400% increase in the number of polluted waters, polluted streams, and lakes and aquifers in the state of Iowa. This was a period of time, most of which we weren't necessarily increasing hog production. We were simply just replacing our independent family hog farmers with large confinement family farming operations. And we were increasing corn production for ethanol and a few other things. For the last 10 years, they've sampled over 1,000 streams a year, and over half of all of the streams sampled in Iowa are found to be impaired or polluted to the point where they would require waste treatment plans by the Environmental Protection Agency. I think it's a clear indication now that when we transferred from family farms to confinement operations, we didn't improve water quality, we made it tremendously worse. As far as the national level is concerned, the Environmental Protection Agency classifies agriculture as the #1 source of non-point source pollution, meaning runoff from the land pollution of rivers and of streams. It's the 3rd leading source of lakes, the 2nd leading source of wetlands, and is a major contributor to pollution of the estuaries along the ocean. We have tremendous dead zones that are growing in the Gulf of Mexico, Chesapeake Bay, and various other places. And agriculture is a primary contributor, and Iowa is the major contributor to the Gulf dead zone. It's the only state where the pollution is growing rather than coming down, because that's where we're building the CAFOs and growing the corn for the ethanol. That's the legacy of industrial agriculture. You know, they argue, they say, well, we're using the latest technologies, you know, to protect the streams and protect the air quality. They're not using the latest technologies. There's technologies available that would reduce the odor. There's technologies available that would cut down on the pollution. There's technologies that we can manage things much better. But when they talk about the technologies, the industry will say, well, but that's not economically feasible. You know what that means? It says if you forced us to do that, we couldn't compete with those independent family farmers that we're displacing. So for us, it's economically feasible. You know, how would you like it if you had a store downtown and somebody asked you to come in and repair your sidewalk or to replace a window or something? You say, well, that's not economically feasible because I couldn't continue to make as much money as I'm making now. You know, the markets are not going to solve this thing. If we wait till things are economically feasible, we will do nothing. Responsible agriculture ultimately is going to require responsible government that says that the CAFO operators have to do the right thing. For example, on one of the most important public issues that I think is public health, the CAFO operators are basically in a state of denial. You know, there's an abundance of scientific information, for example, on the issue of antibiotic resistance, the most brilliant being MRSA, you know, that now kills more people in the United States than AIDS. And there's clear indication that it's associated with the large confinement animal feeding operations. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention in 2013 issued a statement that said that scientists around the world have provided compelling evidence that link antibiotic resistance in organisms that are harmful to humans to the routine feeding of antibiotics to animals in large confinement animal feeding operations. And they said that this antibiotic-resistant bacteria is spread not only through workers that work in the facilities, that go out into the community, and it's present in the soil and its water, but it's also present in the food supply. And there's been various studies that shows the contamination of the food supply, animal products with bacteria, and roughly about half of what's been found in those studies is antibiotic resistance, resistant to one or more antibiotics as well. The World Health Organization, 2016, said we must reduce antibiotic use in animal operations, and in hospitals, we improve it in hospitals as well. It says that in animal operations, we should dramatically reduce the use of also antibiotics that are used for medical purposes in humans, but we should eliminate the use of antibiotics for growth promotion and for prevention of disease unless it's specifically diagnosed by a veterinarian. But yet we continue to use it in this country with very modest voluntary kinds of regulations at this point. The United Nations in 2007